She had never thought it would come to this. The invitation to a wedding, once just another fleeting moment in a busy life, suddenly felt like the weight of her entire existence. Sophie had been a servant in the Winters family estate for 12 years, but today the weight of her silence and obedience became almost unbearable. Subscribe and write in the comments, where are you watching this video from? The mansion stood tall and imposing on the edge of the city. Its grandeur seemed to swallow everything around it, including her. As Sophie walked through the marble halls early that morning, her feet barely made a sound. The chandeliers above glinted in the half-light, casting long shadows that seemed to echo the emptiness she felt inside. Each movement felt automatic. She had learned the rhythm of the estate years ago, the exact way to set the table, the precise timing for refilling the coffee cups, the way to blend into the background without being seen. She didn't belong here, not really. She never had. The Winters family treated her as an invisible entity, a fixture in the background of their perfect lives. They never spoke her name, except when they needed her to perform a task. She had been the maid, the help, the one who cleaned the spaces they occupied, who polished their silver and set their meals. She had accepted this role for over a decade, always assuming that it was just temporary, that someday her time would come. But it never did. There was never a moment of warmth, of genuine recognition, only polite indifference. She had never asked for much, just a small acknowledgement, a sign that she mattered. But all those years, those hopes had been in vain. It was early in the morning when she set the coffee on the table for Mrs. Winters. The woman didn't acknowledge her, only gave a quick nod of approval when Sophie handed her the cup. Sophie had long since stopped expecting more. There was no gratitude, no warmth, just a cold, practiced routine. The daughters, Belinda and Ashley, followed shortly after, their laughter high-pitched and sharp as they commented on the most trivial things. It was always the same. Superficial, effortless conversation, as if their world existed solely for their enjoyment, and Sophie's presence was nothing more than an invisible thread in the fabric of it all. As she poured the coffee, Sophie couldn't help but feel the sting of being unseen. The Winters family's lives were a spectacle she was never invited to partake in. They didn't notice the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her body ached from years of hard work. They didn't see the years slipping by, one task at a time, as she poured her energy into a family that would never see her as anything more than a servant. Later that morning, Sophie walked through the halls, adjusting pillows and straightening paintings. Her work was never done, but it didn't matter. There was no reward for the perfection she created, no acknowledgement for the meticulous care she put into every task. She wasn't even allowed to be tired. If she made a mistake, it was a silent reprimand, an invisible punishment that no one mentioned, but that she felt deep in her bones. As she cleaned the kitchen, Sophie's mind drifted. She thought about her father, far away in a small town, the man who had raised her with love and encouragement. He had always been there, always supportive, always reminding her that she could be more than this life. But she had chosen to stay. She had told herself that the Winters family would eventually see her, eventually appreciate her. But after 12 years, she realized that she was nothing more than a shadow in their world, a background figure in a story that wasn't hers. The phone call from her sister had come late one night. Her father was ill, and though Sophie had promised to visit, work had always come first. By the time she finally received the news that he had passed, it felt as though a weight had crushed her chest. She hadn't even been there to say goodbye. She hadn't been there for the man who had given everything for her. And the Winters family? They didn't even acknowledge her loss. The next morning, as she set the breakfast table for them, Sophie's heart was heavy with grief, but she kept her head down. She knew what they expected. Nothing more than perfection. They would never understand what it felt like to lose someone, not when their lives were so insulated from reality. Sophie's grief wasn't something they cared about. It was a mere inconvenience. It was during that breakfast, as the Winters family discussed their plans for the upcoming gala, that Sophie realized something. Her grief, her pain, her existence. It had all been swallowed up by their world. She wasn't even allowed to mourn in peace. They had no understanding of what it meant to be a person who had given everything to a family that couldn't care less. She was just a fixture, a piece of the background that would always be there unnoticed. But today, something shifted. As she cleaned the plates and moved silently around the room, Sophie realized that she was done. She was done being invisible, done being treated as though she didn't matter. The pain of losing her father, the years of silence, the way she had been forced to erase herself, it was all too much. She had lived in their shadows for far too long. Sophie stepped away from the table, her hands trembling as she folded the napkins. She had given up everything for this family, but now it was time to leave. She wasn't going to ask for permission. She wasn't going to wait for them to notice her. She was going to walk out the door, and for the first time in years, she would choose herself. The decision wasn't easy, but it was final. Sophie knew what she had to do. The Winters family could go on with their lives, but she wasn't going to let her life be defined by their indifference anymore. The door was open, and she was walking through it. There was no going back, but for the first time, Sophie felt something new. The freedom to be seen, the freedom to choose her own path. And in that moment, she realized that this was the first step toward reclaiming everything she had lost. It wasn't supposed to feel this way. When Ava first stepped into the Carrington estate, she thought it would be different, easier even. But as she stood in the vast, echoing foyer, the weight of exclusion pressed down on her chest. She had hoped in the quiet corners of her heart that things might change. She had dreamed of being more than the invisible, quiet maid who scurried about in the background. But the reality was undeniable. She was still just the help, a shadow moving through the grandeur of their world, unnoticed and unseen. The guests, all impeccably dressed in their expensive suits and dresses, drifted through the space like models in a magazine spread. The rich, with their effortless grace, laughed and talked in sharp, polished voices as if they owned the air itself. Eva, on the other hand, felt like a foreigner in their midst. She watched from the edges of the grand ballroom, her lavender dress feeling far too simple for the extravagance that surrounded her. No one seemed to notice her, not in any meaningful way. She was just there to serve, to clean, to disappear. As she moved through the room, trying her best to remain unnoticed, she heard snippets of conversation, vacations in Europe, business deals, gossip about other socialites and their latest exploits. It was all so foreign, so detached from the world she knew. She had never been a part of this life, never been invited to share in the luxury and the glamour. And tonight, she realized with a sharp pang, she never would be. Lila, her childhood friend, stood at the center of the room, radiant in a designer gown that shimmered under the chandeliers. She was surrounded by a group of familiar faces, all of them laughing, all of them equal in their shared wealth and beauty. Eva felt her heart twist as she watched Lila effortlessly glide through the crowd, her laughter ringing out like music. She wasn't the girl Eva remembered. She wasn't the girl who had shared secrets with her in the quiet corners of their small town. She was someone else now, someone untouchable. Eva couldn't help but feel small in the face of all this. It wasn't just the wealth, the luxury that set her apart. It was the way they moved through life, unburdened by the daily struggles that had shaped Ava's own world. They didn't know what it was like to scrape by, to work two jobs just to make ends meet, to never quite feel like you were enough. They didn't understand what it was to exist in a world that constantly reminded you of your place at the bottom. As she carried a tray of drinks across the room, Ava overheard a conversation between Lila's daughters, Belinda and Ashley. They were in their 20s, dressed in the latest designer loungewear, their faces lit by the glow of their phones. Belinda was scrolling through social media, her voice dripping with disdain. "Did you see what Darla wore to the club last night?" she said. "It was tragic." Ashley giggled. "It looked like something the maid would wear." The joke was thrown casually, like a piece of trash discarded on the floor. Ava's stomach clenched at the words, the sting of their thoughtlessness cutting deeper than she expected. She had heard words like these before, had felt the sharp edges of their barbed comments, but this time it hurt more than ever. She had spent so many years serving them, giving everything of herself to make their lives easier. And this was how they saw her. She stood there frozen as the laughter of the two women rang in her ears. She knew she should let it go, knew that it wasn't worth the energy to react. But it was hard, so hard to ignore the years of resentment that built up inside her, to swallow down the truth that they would never see her as anything other than a tool, to be used and discarded when no longer needed. Lila's voice interrupted her thoughts, calling her name from across the room. Ava looked up, startled. She hadn't expected to be noticed, not with the way Lila was surrounded by her perfect life. But there was Lila, standing with her usual grace, her smile warm but distant. "Eva," she said, her voice carrying a hint of surprise. "I didn't see you there. It's been so long." Ava swallowed, her throat tight. "Yes, it has," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's good to see you again." Lila smiled, her eyes scanning the room. "You look well. You're still working here, I see." Eva nodded, forcing a smile. "Yes, ma'am. Still here." There it was again, that weight of the word ma'am, that subtle reminder of her place in this world. Lila didn't mean it maliciously. She didn't see the subtle insult, the way the words stripped away her dignity. But Ava felt it. She felt it deep in her bones. As they spoke, Lila's attention drifted, her eyes moving back to the group she had left behind. Ava was, once again, just the help. She wasn't worth more than a passing glance, a polite acknowledgement before Lila returned to her world. Ava turned and walked away, her footsteps light but heavy with the weight of everything she had come to understand. The truth had settled in her chest like a stone. She wasn't a part of their world, and she never would be. As the night wore on, Ava retreated to the kitchen, the only place in the estate where she could escape the weight of their gaze. The kitchen was familiar, a place where she didn't have to pretend, where she could move freely without the expectation of perfection. She stood at the counter, chopping vegetables for the next course, the rhythm of the knife against the cutting board grounding her. The sounds of the party echoed in the background, but they felt distant, like the noises of a world she had no place in. As she worked, Eva allowed herself a moment of reflection. She had spent so many years chasing something she would never have, a seat at their table, a place in their lives. But now she saw clearly, this wasn't her world. It was never going to be her world. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel the truth of that. She didn't belong here. And maybe, just maybe, that was okay. When the night finally ended, Eva retired to her small room in the servants' wing. The silence was a welcome relief, the quiet darkness a balm to her weary soul. As she lay in bed staring up at the ceiling, she felt a shift inside her. It was a small change, a flicker of something new, a realization that she no longer needed their approval, their recognition. She didn't need to be a part of their world to be worthy, and that, she thought, was the first step toward freedom. That she didn't need anyone else to tell her that. Lila's words were kind, but as she walked away, her attention once again shifting to the group she had been with. Eva felt the reality of the moment sink in. Nothing had changed. Lila had seen her, yes, but that moment of connection was fleeting. In the end, she was still just a background figure in their world, a face to serve, a hand to clean. Lila would go on with her life, and Eva would remain in the margins, invisible once again. Eva couldn't help but feel the weight of that truth. It was a hard truth, one she had been running from for years. But now, standing there in the Carrington estate, she couldn't ignore it anymore. She wasn't a part of their world. Not really, not in any meaningful way. And the realization hit her harder than she expected. But as the evening wore on, Eva felt something else, something she hadn't expected, something that started to shift within her. It wasn't just the sharp sting of exclusion. No, it was something deeper, something that cut to the very core of who she was. It was the beginning of a rebellion inside her, a quiet rebellion that refused to be silenced any longer. She didn't have to fit into their world. She didn't need their acceptance. She was enough on her own. The weight of the realization grew heavier as the night passed. Eva felt the walls of the Carrington estate closing in around her, their cold marble floors, their towering columns, the glimmering chandeliers that seemed to mock her at every turn. She had spent so many years trying to be something she wasn't, trying to mold herself into something she could never be, but she didn't have to anymore. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became. She didn't have to shrink to make room for them. She didn't have to play their game, follow their rules, or live up to their expectations. For the first time, Ava saw herself clearly, no longer as the maid or the help, but as something more, something whole. As the evening drew to a close, Eva found herself retreating into the shadows once again. She felt the familiar pull, the desire to disappear into the background, to slip quietly away without being noticed. But something in her held back. Something told her that it was time to stop disappearing. She made her way through the grand hall, her feet moving without thought, until she found herself standing in the kitchen. It was quiet now. The bustle of the party a distant hum, the servants already beginning to clean up after the guests. Eva stood in the silence, the weight of everything pressing down on her chest. She had always kept her head down, kept her thoughts and feelings hidden away, swallowed the words she wanted to say. But now in the quiet of the kitchen, something inside her shifted. Her hands, which had so often been busy with the tasks of others, were still for a moment. She breathed in the stillness, feeling it settle in her bones. And then, for the first time in a long while, Eva allowed herself to feel. She allowed herself to feel the anger, the hurt, the frustration that had been building up inside her for so long. It wasn't just about the Carringtons. It wasn't just about the way they treated her. It was about everything. The years she had spent shrinking, the years she had spent trying to be someone she wasn't, the years she had spent denying who she really was. In the silence of the kitchen, Eva made a decision. She was done. Done with hiding, done with playing by their rules. She wouldn't be invisible anymore. She wouldn't be just a servant, just a maid, just the help. When she left the estate that night, it wasn't just a physical departure. It was something much deeper, something that had been years in the making. It was the beginning of her breaking free from the life that had confined her, the life that had kept her silent for so long. And as she stepped into the cold night air, Ava knew that nothing would ever be the same again. She wasn't just leaving the Carrington estate behind. She was leaving the old version of herself, the one that had been forced into silence, behind as well. The woman who had always disappeared into the shadows was gone. In her place stood a woman who was ready to be seen, ready to speak, ready to reclaim her life. It was a moment that came unexpectedly, like a storm that had been gathering quietly in the distance, and then suddenly everything changed. Ava had been walking through the familiar halls of the Carrington estate, her hands automatically smoothing the wrinkles in the tablecloths, wiping away invisible dust. It had become second nature to her, this dance of silence and servitude, moving between rooms, unnoticed and unimportant. But today there was something different in the air. She had always been a shadow in their world, a faceless figure who existed only to serve. But today something inside her began to shift. It wasn't anger or bitterness, but something else, something deep within her that refused to stay silent any longer. She was no longer content to play the role they had assigned her. She didn't want to be invisible anymore. And that thought, that simple, quiet realization, began to unearth something inside her that she had buried for years. It started when Mrs. Carrington had asked her to bring in the tea. Eva had moved quickly, her mind racing as she prepared the tray, her hands trembling slightly as she placed the delicate cups and saucers on the silver tray. As she entered the room, she expected the usual indifference, the polite yet dismissive nods that never reached beyond the surface. But this time, something in her snapped. As she set the tray down in front of Mrs. Carrington, Eva felt the weight of the moment. She had been here, in this house, for over a decade, serving them without question, without complaint. But now, as she stood there, looking at the woman who had never once acknowledged her as more than an object, something inside her broke. For the first time, she didn't just feel invisible. She felt like she had been complicit in her own silence. She had allowed them to treat her as less than human, to see her as nothing more than an extension of their wealth and privilege. "I'll be right back with the sugar," she said, her voice tight with an emotion she couldn't quite place. But as she turned to leave, Mrs. Carrington didn't even look up from her newspaper. Eva's breath caught in her throat as she walked back into the kitchen. She wanted to scream, to cry, to lash out at the injustice that had followed her for years. But instead, she felt something else, something more powerful than anger. It was a sense of clarity, a sense of liberation. She had spent so many years trying to be what they wanted her to be, trying to fit into a world that would never accept her. But she didn't have to anymore. The realization hit her like a wave, crashing over her with such force that she felt it in every inch of her being. She had been living someone else's life, playing a role that was never hers to begin with. And now for the first time, she understood that she didn't have to play it anymore. Eva's heart pounded as she stood there in the quiet of the kitchen. She knew she had reached a turning point, a moment where everything would change. The Carringtons would never see her as anything more than the help. But that didn't matter anymore. She was done with their world. She was done with being invisible, with shrinking into the background to make room for their comfort. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew that she couldn't go back to the way things had been. She had spent so long serving them, pleasing them, trying to earn a place in their world. But now she saw the truth. She didn't need them to validate her. She didn't need their approval to know that she was worthy. As she moved through the halls of the estate, her mind was racing. She couldn't stay here any longer. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, when deep down, she knew it wasn't. She had spent too many years ignoring her own voice, letting it get buried under the weight of their expectations. But now she was ready to speak. Eva paused for a moment in front of the grand staircase. She looked up at the towering columns, the polished marble floors, the perfect chandeliers that hung like ornaments of wealth and power. For a long time, she had believed that this was all there was. This world of privilege, of endless luxury, of people who lived above the rest of the world. But now she saw it for what it was. A prison, a gilded cage where she had been trapped, but never truly part of. She turned away from the staircase, her footsteps echoing through the empty halls. There was no turning back now. She had made up her mind. She couldn't stay in this house, in this life anymore. She couldn't keep pretending that she was happy, that she was content with the role they had assigned her. It was time to go. With each step, Eva felt a sense of freedom growing inside her. The weight of the years she had spent in silence was starting to lift. She was leaving the Carringtons behind, but more importantly, she was leaving the old version of herself behind. The version of herself that had been afraid to speak, afraid to stand up for herself, afraid to be seen. She wasn't afraid anymore. As she reached the front door, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the handle, she stopped for a moment and glanced back. The house was still, the silence heavy around her. And then, with a deep breath, she opened the door and stepped out into the night. The air was cool, the sky dark and empty, but for the first time in years, Eva felt a sense of clarity. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that she was finally free. Free from the expectations of others, free from the weight of their world. She was no longer invisible. She was ready to take control of her life, to step into the world as her true self. And nothing, not even the Carringtons, could take that away from her. It was the first morning in years that Eva didn't wake up to the sound of the alarm clock. The silence was overwhelming, almost suffocating, but at the same time, it felt like a breath of fresh air, a rare gift. She had left everything behind, her old life, the Carrington estate, the suffocating silence that had been her reality for so long. But now as she lay in a bed that was hers and only hers, she felt a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. For the first time in years, she didn't know what came next. She was free, but the price of freedom was uncertainty. She sat up slowly, letting the soft sheets fall away from her body. The room was modest but warm, filled with sunlight that streamed through the window. There were no chandeliers, no polished marble floors, no high ceilings or gold-framed portraits of dead ancestors. It was quiet, and in its quietness, she could hear her own thoughts. For the first time in what felt like forever, she was not just a shadow moving through someone else's world. She was herself, and the weight of that realization was both heavy and liberating. Eva hadn't planned to leave, at least not like this. It wasn't until she had stood in that kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of a life that wasn't truly hers, that she had made the decision. She had never planned to leave behind the stability that the Carringtons provided, despite the endless hours of work and the complete lack of appreciation. But it wasn't just the work that had driven her to this point. It was the realization that her own life, her own dreams, had been put on hold for too long. It was the understanding that she had allowed herself to be defined by someone else's expectations. But now she was free. And in that freedom, she could finally hear herself, her true self, the person she had buried under years of silence and submission, the person she had always been, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The future was uncertain, and that uncertainty made her pulse race. What was she supposed to do now? Where was she supposed to go? For years, she had been a maid, a servant, a nameless face in the background, but now she had no title, no role to fill. She was just Eva, and that thought, that simple thought, was both terrifying and exhilarating. She didn't know what it meant to be herself in the world, outside of the Carrington estate, but she was determined to figure it out. The world, she realized, was hers to shape. Eva got out of bed and walked to the small kitchen in the apartment she had rented. It wasn't much. A small, cozy space with mismatched furniture and a stove that creaked when she used it. But it was hers. She could make her own decisions here. No one would tell her what to do. No one would tell her when to get up or what to wear. It was a strange kind of power, one that came from nothing more than a simple choice: to walk away from everything she had known. She boiled water for tea, the sound of the kettle filling the small room with an ordinary comfort. The steam rose in soft tendrils, and Eva inhaled deeply, letting the warmth fill her lungs. There was something deeply satisfying in the simplicity of it all. For so long she had been consumed by the needs of others, their schedules, their desires. But now, as the tea steeped in the pot, she could focus on what she needed, what she wanted. It was a small act, but in that moment it felt monumental. Her phone buzzed on the counter, breaking her train of thought. She hesitated before picking it up, unsure of who might be calling. She hadn't spoken to anyone since she left the estate. Her fingers hovered over the screen, and then, with a deep breath, she answered. "Hello, Eva?" It was a voice she hadn't heard in weeks. Lorna, her sister. "Are you okay? I've been trying to reach you." Eva smiled, a small, almost sad smile. She had meant to call her sister, to explain what had happened, but the weight of the decision had kept her silent. "I'm fine," she said softly, her voice still unfamiliar to her. "I'm just figuring things out." Lorna's voice softened. "You know you can come home, right? If you need a place, you have one." Eva's heart tightened at the words, but she couldn't bring herself to say them. She couldn't go back to the life she had left behind. Not yet. "I know, Lorna. I'm just not sure where I'm going yet." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before Lorna spoke again. "You don't have to have it all figured out right now. Just take it one step at a time." Eva closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her once again. But there was something different now. A sense of peace, maybe. Or maybe it was just the realization that she had made a choice. And for the first time in a long time, that choice felt like the right one. "I will," she said, her voice firm. After she hung up, Eva stared out the window at the city below. The streets were busy, people hurrying to work, their lives moving forward in ways she couldn't even comprehend. But for the first time in years, she wasn't rushing. She wasn't moving according to someone else's timetable. She was moving at her own pace, in her own time. She didn't have to know exactly what came next. She didn't need to have a plan. She just needed to trust that the path would unfold in its own time, one step at a time. With a quiet resolve, Eva turned back to her tea. She would take each day as it came, and when she was ready, when she had found her way, she would begin again. And this time, she would be the one to choose. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch our next video to discover another powerful journey and share this one with someone who needs to hear.